The fountain pen slipped from his fingers and fell onto the snow-white tablecloth, leaving a thin black streak, like a cut through silk. In that instant, a $500 million deal, the kind usually sealed with wine and polite smiles, froze mid-air, as if time itself had stopped. The Marlowe Room top floor of Kingsley and Finch in Chicago. The glass ceiling mirrored the rain outside, each drop a thread of silver stitching across the night. Below them, the Chicago River curved like a cold blade. The air shimmered with the scent of walnut wood burgundy wine and that costly silence that only exists in rooms where power changes hands. At the head of the table sat Richard Collins, 58 CEO of Collins Innovations. His back straight, his practiced smile perfectly in place, charming, refined, and never reaching the steel gray of his eyes. To his right was Mark Ellison, 41, Vice President of Acquisitions, tapping his finger against the glass, a restless rhythm like a horse itching for the starting gate. They were here to close the deal. They were used to winning. Across from them sat Eleanor Hayes, 67, her simple black dress draped over a slender frame like a quiet line of ink. She did not speak. She only watched, her eyes still as a midnight lake and just as dangerous. Beside her sat Daniel Brooks, 33. Her assistant slightly angled toward her tablet in hand, his expression composed, professional, so calm that one could mistake him for a piece of fine furniture. As Richard spoke of synergy ecosystems and global vision, Daniel translated swiftly into precise movements of American Sign Language. His hands were clean, deliberate, exact. No wasted motion, no stray emotion. It should have been perfect. But it wasn't. At the edge of the chandelier's glow, Chloe. Parker, 24, adjusted the white apron around her waist, a small movement carrying an entire life hidden in its folds. A third-year student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, she worked the night shift to cover tuition. Growing up in Ohio with her deaf mother, Chloe had learned ASL before she could say the word mom. Her shoulders were used to silver trays, her eyes trained to read what people never said. A swallowed sigh, a lifted brow, a hand tightening out of pride. In the Marlowe Room, waitstaff were ghosts appearing precisely when needed, vanishing before sound could follow. Richard smiled and talked about new opportunities. Mark cut in, lowering his voice. Simplify the incentive structure. Faster. Bigger upfront payout. His words slid across the table like the edge of a scalpel. Daniel kept signing, careful and clean as polished glass. But Chloe noticed what Daniel's hands could never capture: the cold flash in Eleanor's pupils every time Mark raised his tone or made those broad, patronizing gestures as if explaining things to a child. A heavy drop of rain hit the glass overhead. Chloe heard it clearly, sharply. In Richard's mind were integration modules, supply chains, and market curves. He calculated quickly. Trim employee bonuses consolidate intellectual property under a shared asset clause. Insert a post-merger adjustment term. Standard practice, he thought. Common procedure. Mark's thoughts were different. He craved the rush of dominance, the thrill of twisting someone's wrist until they signed. The light from his watch flared when he leaned forward, his voice slowing and hardening. It's a very good price. Each word landed heavy, reeking of condescension. Eleanor didn't blink. She gave the faintest nod, a ripple on a still lake, followed by a quiet, invisible sigh. For 6 months she had lived on silence, on discipline, on the faint spells that came like passing shadows, on faith that if someone still had the courage to look truth in the eye, her legacy wouldn't be sold by the pound. Daniel looked up for a brief second, his gaze colliding with Chloe's. A fleeting touch, like two strangers brushing shoulders in a crowded street. He turned back to his hands, precise, responsible, and utterly alone. Chloe set the tray on the side table. Her heart drummed like a small snare behind the curtain. The air was thick as honey, stretching every movement into slow motion. She read Eleanor's gestures, the spread of her palm, the rhythm of her wrist, the pauses between motions, all the layers of meaning that Daniel had to sterilize for decorum's sake. She also read Richard and Mark, the tight corners of their mouths, the narrowing pupils at the mention of R&D valuation. Every muscle in their faces spoke to her clear as printed words. A draft slipped through the doorframe, carrying the scent of rain and metal. Somewhere below, a train whistle wailed a long, lonely note. Chloe remembered her mother's voice. When they speak loudly, watch their hands. The truth is there. Eleanor's hands were now still as a drawn bow. Refill. Mark lifted his glass without looking up. Chloe stepped forward, tilting the bottle. The red wine slid into crystal like dark silk. In the soft rush of pouring, Mark's voice dropped lower, carving his words into sharp pieces. Richard nodded this time without a smile. The trap was set. Eleanor turned toward the window, eyes fixed on the black river. She didn't need the reflection to see her own face. She was staring into the future of her company and watching it come apart, screw by screw. Her hand lifted slightly, a signal so subtle that only Daniel caught it. He translated clean and neutral. But Chloe heard the unspoken question beneath it. Is anyone here truly seeing? The moment stretched like a held breath. Chloe set the bottle down her palm, slick with sweat. The restaurant's rule echoed in her mind like a hammer. Be invisible, be silent, disappear. Outside, the rain tapped relentlessly against the glass like a reminder. She tightened her grip on the apron's edge and looked up. Eleanor's eyes met hers. A small spark passed between them, tiny but sharp enough to tear through the velvet curtain of the room. Chloe drew a deep, steady breath and took her first step out of the shadows. And the Marlowe room. That gilded box of power began to shift. The wine glass in Mark Ellison's hand trembled slightly, sending ripples of dark red spreading across the crystal like blood blooming in water. He didn't notice that behind him, the young waitress had stopped moving. He didn't know that every word, every frown, every careless smirk of his was being recorded not by any microphone, but by the eyes of the only person in the room who was truly awake. Chloe Parker. She stood there at the edge of the chandelier's glow, one hand still holding the silver tray. Every word Richard spoke sliced through the air thin and sharp as a blade beneath skin. Numbers, technical jargon, phrases like cost reduction and restructuring, all spoken in the tone of people who had long forgotten that on the other side of the table sat a human being, not a brand name. Eleanor Hayes remained silent. Her hands were gently clasped before her chest, as if in prayer. Only her eyes stayed open, dark and deep, following every movement from across the table. When Mark began speaking louder, slower, using exaggerated gestures to help her understand, Daniel Brooks continued to translate into sign language, but his voice trembled faintly, carrying a trace of shame. He knew his clients were being disrespectful, yet his position allowed him no protest. A lot of money, Mark emphasized, extending both hands as if offering candy to a child. The room went utterly still. Chloe could hear the wall clock ticking tick-tock in the heavy silence. Eleanor lifted her head. 1 beat, 2. She gave a slight nod, then signed a few gestures, slow and dignified, like part of a sacred ritual. Daniel interpreted, "Ms. Hayes understands your proposal." But Chloe, who had learned sign language from her own mother, saw something else. Eleanor's movements didn't simply say, "understand." They said enough. Polite, but cold. She saw Eleanor's lips pressed together, the veins on her wrist standing out, and a fleeting sadness passed through the older woman's eyes, not from insult, but from disappointment. Disappointment in the world, in the kind of power that shouts louder only to hide its emptiness. In Chloe's mind, a memory flared. When she was 10, she had stood beside her mother at a cashier's counter as a man laughed because her mother couldn't understand normal speech. Chloe had raised her hands and signed boldly, "She listens with her heart." Now in the Marlowe room, that memory returned like fire. Richard leaned toward Mark, his voice lowered but still slicing through the thick air. "Let her stay silent. Wrap it up quickly. Cut the R&D bonuses, consolidate all management after the merger. They have no idea what's happening." Mark chuckled softly. "Good. She can't speak, which means she can't fight back." Chloe froze. Her hand trembled, the silver tray nearly slipping from her grip. They had just spoken an act of deceit right in front of the woman they intended to deceive, and they believed no one understood. But she did. Eleanor was still staring out the window. The Chicago River reflected the city lights in molten streaks of silver. Chloe imagined what it would be like if Eleanor could hear them. But no, she already understood. Her straight shoulders quivered ever so slightly, as if restraining a sigh. Daniel lowered his head, avoiding the eyes of the two men. He knew they were wrong, but he couldn't intervene. In this world, silence meant safety. Chloe saw the conflict burning quietly in his eyes. The wind hissed through the doorframe, and rain struck the glass in long white ribbons. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace mingled with the scent of leather wine and lies. Chloe's heart pounded so hard it felt ready to tear through her ribs. The first rule of service echoed in her mind: never interfere with guests. The second: every problem is solved through silence. But here, silence was killing someone's dignity. She looked at Eleanor. That woman didn't need pity. She needed respect. Chloe's hand tightened, sweat dampening the edge of her apron. She knew one wrong move could cost her job tuition everything, but if she did nothing, she would lose herself. And then Eleanor spoke. Her voice was hoarse, fragile, almost a whisper to herself, but Chloe could read the words from the movement of her lips. "Does no one see?" Everything stopped. Chloe knew it was an invitation. Not in words, but in instinct. She took a deep breath, set the tray down, adjusted her apron, and stepped toward the table. Each footfall on the wool carpet sounded like a drum beat echoing from her chest. Mark and Richard were still laughing, oblivious. Daniel looked up, eyes wide with shock. Eleanor turned her gaze, deep and laced with loneliness, struck straight into Chloe's heart. Chloe stopped beside her, bowed low, both hands placed over her chest. It wasn't the bow of a waitress. It was the bow of one human being to another who had been wronged. The room was so silent they could hear the rain falling outside. Chloe raised her head, her eyes shining clear and sharp like a blade drawn from its sheath. She lifted her hands and began to sign slowly, deliberately, in the language only one person in the room could understand. "Please allow me to speak for you." And in that moment, not only the air, but the entire world seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. The only sound in the room was the wind sweeping across the tall windows, making the white curtains tremble. Mark Ellison raised an eyebrow, his face half amused, half mocking. Richard Collins leaned back in his chair, lips curling as if he were watching a cheap comedy. And Eleanor Hayes. She didn't speak, only tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes glowing with a strange light, part surprise, part emotion. Chloe Parker straightened up, her hands still trembling slightly but her gaze unshaken. Her voice was clear and steady, as if every word had been waiting in her heart all her life. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand your sign language. If you'll allow me, I can interpret for you instead of Mr. Brooks." Her voice rang through the elegant space like a single note breaking a silent orchestra. Richard laughed first, a dry sound scraping between his teeth. "Are you joking? This is a private meeting. Who gave you permission to interfere?" Chloe turned to him, her steady gaze making the man hesitate for half a second. "I only want the truth to be heard. But if you're afraid of that, then maybe the problem isn't me." The air froze. Daniel Brooks stared, shock and admiration flickering in his eyes. He knew she had broken every rule, yet he also knew she had done what he himself hadn't found the courage to do. He gave a tiny nod, barely visible, a silent gesture of approval. Eleanor slowly lifted her hand. A small motion, yet its authority shifted the entire room. She signed a few measured gestures, her eyes never leaving Chloe. Daniel translated, his voice trembling. "Ms. Hayes wants her to sit down." Richard's jaw dropped. "Sit down." "This waitress." But Eleanor only glanced his way, and that one cold look was enough to silence him. She gestured again. A nearby chair slid gently out. Chloe drew a deep breath and sat. The leather seat was warm and soft, yet beneath her feet she could feel the edge of an abyss. She leaned toward Eleanor, waiting. Eleanor began to sign slowly, each movement deliberate and rhythmic like a silent symphony. Chloe watched, her eyes glistening. Then she looked up and spoke, her voice calm, though a faint tremor touched its edges. "Mrs. Hayes would like to explain why she hasn't spoken." She paused, meeting the eyes of both men. 6 months ago, she was in an accident. It caused a neurological injury that prevents her brain from forming English words when under stress. Her memory, intelligence, and leadership remain fully intact, but language itself was locked away. Whenever her emotions rise beyond control, English vanishes, and she's left with the only form of communication her brain allows: sign language. Richard squinted. "So, why not say that from the start?" Chloe translated his question. Eleanor replied briefly. Chloe spoke, her tone firm, because she didn't want pity, and she didn't want to be treated like a broken product. Her voice sharpened, clear as glass. "She's not here asking for help. She came to see whether the men trying to buy her company are worthy of running it." The words hit the table like ice. Mark let out a dry laugh. "Worthy? We're buying it. We're paying. That's enough." Chloe turned to him, her tone lower, deliberate. "No. Not when the price is paid in disrespect." Eleanor looked at the young woman, her eyes soft yet filled with a deep ache. Daniel bowed his head, avoiding her gaze. He knew Eleanor had long lost faith in the decency of the corporate world. But now, amid the firestorm, someone had stepped out of the shadows and reignited what she thought was gone. Richard leaned forward, his voice suddenly coated in false sympathy. "Ms. Hayes, I'm sorry about your condition, but let us help you. We can handle everything. You just need to rest." Chloe translated, but when Eleanor responded, her hands cut through the air with such precision that even those who didn't understand could feel the defiance. "She says," Chloe announced, lifting her head, "I don't need anyone to help me breathe." The air cracked. Eleanor signed again, longer this time. "She says," Chloe continued that to her, "this isn't just a business deal. It's a legacy. And a legacy cannot be handed to those who despise human dignity." Mark shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward. "What is this? Who gave you the right to speak for her?" Chloe turned, her eyes burning with a fire she hadn't known she possessed. "The only person in this room who has that right is Mrs. Hayes." In that moment, Daniel exhaled a quiet surrender. He knew everything had changed. Eleanor gave a small nod, her lips trembling as if in prayer, yet her gestures were steady, powerful as she signed the next sentence. "She says," Chloe translated, locking eyes with the two men, "that her test is over." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Then Eleanor placed her hand on the table, a small but resolute motion. She gave another signal. Daniel understood. He reached into his bag, pulled out a thick folder, and set it down. "She wants you to review every clause again, because if respect has a price from this moment on, it just went up." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, beating against the glass. Inside that lavish room, a woman once dismissed reclaimed her power, and across from her, an anonymous waitress had become the voice the world never saw coming. The rain kept falling, each drop striking the glass panes like a drumbeat, marking the shift of power unfolding within the golden light of the room. Outside Chicago gleamed with the brilliance of skyscraper lights. Inside, the Marlowe room felt like a pressurized chamber, every breath audible, every glance sharp enough to cut through skin. Richard Collins took a deep breath. The businessman's smile returned to his face, but this time it was distorted. "All right," he said softly, his tone almost intimate. "No one wants to turn this meeting into a misunderstanding. Let's call this an opportunity to better understand each other. Shall we? Mark?" "Mark," Ellison nodded, trying to appear at ease, though his eyes were streaked with red. Eleanor Hayes sat motionless, her posture as straight as a candle resisting the wind. She signed a short series of gestures, not fast, but deliberate. Chloe read and translated clearly. "Mrs. Hayes says, if you truly want to understand, start by being honest." Her voice was steady, neither raised nor low, but each word carried the weight of truth. Richard glanced at Mark and gave a faint smile. "Of course, we're very honest. She can review our revised proposal much clearer than the last one." From his polished leather briefcase, he pulled out a thick stack of papers and placed them on the table. Dark brown cover ivory pages, the words "Revised Agreement" printed thin and sharp as a blade. Eleanor glanced at it once and signaled Chloe to read. Chloe opened the document. The smell of fresh ink and paper was so sterile it made her stomach tighten. She skimmed through the clauses, rows of small type like walls built to trap. Mark began speaking in that smooth, sugary voice. "Just a quick look. Nothing complicated. It's mostly technical. The main part's at the end. We've added 5% to the total value. A generous offer, truly." Richard added, "Yes, and clauses 7B and 12B are just standard legal stuff. No need to worry." But Chloe didn't stop. Her fingers moved down the page, her eyes sharp. She used to help her father, a low-ranking city clerk in Ohio, review home purchase contracts. She knew how to recognize words pretending to be harmless, and here the scent of deceit was thick enough to choke on. Clause 7B. She said, her eyes still on the document. Allows Collins Innovations to reassess the intellectual property value of Hayes Robotics after the merger, meaning you could sell the patents without Mrs. Hayes's consent. Mark flinched, masking it with a short laugh. "Just an accounting procedure, young lady." She turned toward him, her gaze like glass. "Procedures don't need to hide in fine print." The room fell silent. Richard crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Miss Parker, you're just a waitress. Don't act like a lawyer." Chloe drew a slow breath and met his eyes. "Then perhaps you should start learning respect from one." Daniel Brooks struggled to suppress a smile. He looked at the girl, no longer the timid student, but someone translating justice into language. Eleanor's signing quickened her movements, charged with resolve. Chloe continued to interpret. "Mrs. Hayes demands an explanation as to why the R&D valuation was removed from the asset list. She says that's the heart of the company." Richard looked down at the documents, avoiding the women's gaze. R&D. "Oh, we merged that under general assets. It's still there. Nothing's missing." Chloe relayed his words, then paused and added slowly, "Mrs. Hayes says, when someone hides numbers, it's never because they're small." The tension split the air. Mark muttered a curse under his breath. Eleanor calmly took a napkin, placed it on her fingertips, and signed again, her movements neat and sharp. "Mrs. Hayes says," Chloe translated, "that Project Helix, the Biointelligence Research Division, is entering its final testing phase. Its potential value is 3 times that of this deal. And you've removed it from the valuation." Mark swallowed hard. Richard started to speak, but Eleanor raised her hand. her eyes cut through both men like light through glass. For the first time that night, Chloe saw clearly who held the power. Not the ones who shouted loudest, but the one who stayed silent long enough for truth to rise on its own. Eleanor's hands moved again, calm but firm. She says Chloe lifted her head, that arrogance may blind morality, but it can never blind observation. Richard stood abruptly, his face flushed. "Is she threatening me?" Chloe replied slowly. "No, Mr. Collins. She's describing you." Daniel let out a small laugh, unable to hide his satisfaction. Eleanor nodded slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. The storm within her had finally found its voice, not through Daniel, but through the young woman in the white apron, who had dared to break silence and name the truth. Outside, the rain grew heavier, striking the glass in furious rhythm. But inside, another kind of silence began to spread, the silence of power overturned. And in that moment, Chloe knew the real battle had only just begun. The room sank into silence. Only the sound of rain striking the glass remained, blending with the heavy breathing of two men struggling to regain control. Richard Collins clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Mark Ellison turned away, hiding his unease behind a forced smile. But Eleanor Hayes sat upright, steady as a pillar in a storm, her eyes no longer those of a woman underestimated, but of a judge delivering a verdict. Chloe Parker gently placed the contract folder back on the table, her gaze sweeping across each face. Everything that once intimidated her wealth-power status no longer held any weight. There was something in Eleanor's eyes that anchored her, something that forbade her from turning away or staying silent. It was as if Eleanor's silence had passed into her, igniting a flame that now burned in reverse, blazing from within. Richard was the first to break the stillness. "Listen, Miss Parker," he said, his voice losing its polished calm. "I don't know what point you're trying to make, but I don't have time for emotional theatrics. This is business, not a moral lecture." Chloe lifted her chin. "Every deal is a moral test, Mr. Collins. The only difference is, some people pass and some fail." Mark let out a dry laugh. "Cheap philosophy. Who do you think you are, a waitress? The only person in this room who still remembers what respect means." Her words dropped sharp and clean, like a stone shattering the calm surface of power. Daniel Brooks held his breath. He had never seen anyone speak to Richard Collins that way, much less a young woman in a white apron, standing tall between two men worth hundreds of millions. But Eleanor was different. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, yet it was enough to make Chloe's heartbeat quicken. Eleanor signed a few short, decisive gestures. Daniel froze for a moment, then looked at Chloe as if yielding the floor to her. Chloe understood. Eleanor wanted her to speak. She took a steady breath. "Mrs. Hayes says," Chloe translated, "that honesty is not a strategy. It is an instinct one only those who have lost it truly understand the value of." Mark was about to respond, but Eleanor's hands moved again, faster, stronger. "She says," Chloe continued, "you think you're negotiating with someone weak, but in truth she's observing. She wants to know when faced with something you don't understand. Will you choose respect or ridicule?" Richard scoffed. "I don't have time for this moral nonsense. Can we go back to the numbers?" Eleanor leaned slightly forward and signed a longer sequence. She says Chloe translated numbers can't save a deal when the integrity of the people negotiating it has already fallen below them. For the first time, Mark didn't laugh. He turned to Richard, seeking support, but Richard's hands were trembling, his eyes unfocused. He was no longer seeing a powerless woman across the table. He was seeing himself reflected in her gaze, distorted and hollow. Eleanor signed again, slower now, her eyes calm but resolute. "She says..." Chloe paused, her voice thick with emotion. "She spent 40 years building Hayes Robotics, not just with technology, but with trust. And she will not sell that trust to men who can't keep their word." The air felt heavy. the silence dense. Daniel looked down at his hands, his thumb pressing into his palm until his skin turned red. He knew Mrs. Hayes wasn't talking about the deal anymore. She was talking about her life. Richard swallowed hard and finally spoke, his voice awkward. "I think perhaps we should end this here. I'll have the legal team review the documents. Maybe there's been some misunderstanding?" Eleanor raised her hand to stop him. She turned to Daniel and signed a few quick gestures. He understood instantly, but said nothing. "What did she say?" Mark barked. Daniel lifted his head, his tone steady. "Mrs. Hayes says this meeting is over." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor raised her hand again. It moved slowly, but with such finality that every sound in the room seemed to be cut in half. Then for the first time that evening she spoke. Her voice was rough, faint, but every word fell with the weight of iron. "This meeting is over." Everything froze. Mark's mouth hung open. Daniel stared in disbelief, and Chloe, her heart stopped for a moment. Eleanor Hayes had just spoken in English. After months trapped in silence, she had shattered the wall of language through sheer will. She stood. Daniel hurried to pull out her chair, while Richard sat frozen, unable to believe what he'd heard. Eleanor turned to Chloe, touching her shoulder lightly, a small gesture but filled with gratitude. Then she walked toward the door, her back straight, her silver hair glowing under the chandelier's light. The door closed behind her, leaving only the scent of wine, the ink of printed contracts, and two men who had just lost far more than a deal. Chloe stood motionless. No one spoke. But inside her, a sound was rising, the sound of freedom. And outside, the rain kept falling, washing away every trace of the night when power had been turned upside down forever. Chloe stood there staring at the closed door where Eleanor Hayes had just walked out, taking with her the storm that had swept away every trace of deceit in that room. No one moved. Only the steady rhythm of rain striking the glass remained, each drop hitting like nails against the roof. Mark Ellison exhaled sharply, his words slipping through gritted teeth. "God, she just destroyed the entire deal." Richard Collins didn't answer. He dropped heavily into his chair. His hands clenched so tight that the veins on his skin bulged dark and blue. His pride had been shattered not by an equal rival, but by two women, one who could not speak and one who dared to. He turned toward Chloe Parker, his glare burning with rage so intense it could have set her alight. "Do you even know what you've done?" he rasped. "You've just ruined your career and dragged us down with you." Chloe didn't bow her head. "If your career can be destroyed by a single honest translation, then maybe it isn't worth keeping." Mark sprang to his feet, face flushed. She should be fired immediately. But Richard no longer heard him. He sat still, staring at the stack of documents before him, papers that minutes ago had been his pride, now nothing more than stains. He knew the deal was dead, and with it, his reputation was about to sink to the bottom. Chloe turned away. She didn't need to hear another word. All she knew was that somewhere outside, Eleanor Hayes had reclaimed her voice, and somehow in doing so had helped Chloe find hers after years of silence. But the real world had no place for temporary heroes. The door burst open with a violent bang, startling everyone. A tall man stormed in his face, flushed his red tie, pulled too tight. It was Lucien Dubois, the restaurant manager. His face was crimson, his eyes blazing. "Chloe Parker." His voice cracked through the air like a whip. "What in the world have you done?" Chloe stood straight, her hands still damp with sweat. "I only translated for the guest." "Translated." He gave a mocking laugh. "You took it upon yourself to sit at a client's table, interfere in a private meeting, and break the highest rule of Kingsley and Finch. Serve, don't interfere. Do you have any idea who was in that room? Richard Collins, one of the biggest investors in this city." Chloe said nothing. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. When you know something is right, don't wait for permission to do it. Dubois stepped closer, his tone dropping low and venomous. You're fired, right now, and I'll make sure no restaurant in Chicago ever hires you again. You're not just losing a job, you're losing your future. The words cut deep like a blade to the heart. Everything she had worked to hold together, tuition, rent, her dream of graduating, shattered in a single breath. She opened her mouth to speak, but the door behind her opened again. A calm, steady male voice broke through the tension. I'm afraid, Mr. Dubois, that she hasn't done anything wrong. All eyes turned toward the doorway. Daniel Brooks stood there, his suit still neat, his expression no longer composed, but carrying an unmistakable authority. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were the only person allowed to speak in that room. Dubois snapped, "Who are you to interfere with my staff?" Daniel met his gaze without flinching. Daniel Brooks, assistant to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. He pulled a golden badge from his pocket, embossed with the Hayes Robotics logo. And I'm here to inform you that Miss Chloe Parker just prevented a multi-million-dollar deal from becoming an act of international fraud. The room froze. Richard's head jerked up, and Mark took half a step back. Dubois blinked, his voice catching. What are you talking about?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice deep and razor-sharp. "We have a full recording of Mr. Collins and Mr. Ellison discussing their plan to manipulate the contract, cut bonuses, and sell off Hayes Robotics' intellectual property for profit. If you plan to punish an employee who stopped that from happening, I'll make sure our legal department takes this straight to the press." No one spoke. Dubois's face turned pale, his breath quick and uneven. Daniel turned to Chloe, his voice softening. "Mrs. Hayes would like to see you. She's waiting in the car downstairs." Chloe blinked in disbelief. "She wants to see me." Daniel smiled faintly. "She said the only person tonight who did the right thing was you." Then he turned back to Dubois, his tone hardening to steel. "Pack her things. Miss Parker will not be returning to work here. But not because she's fired, because as of tomorrow she'll be working for the Hayes Foundation." The air shattered like glass. Dubois opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Richard sat in stunned silence, and Mark dropped his gaze to the floor. Chloe stood frozen, as if every sound in the world had vanished. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city glimmered in the light after the storm. She didn't know if she was dreaming or awake. All she knew was that in the end, the most reckless act of her life had become the first step toward an entirely new one. Chloe Parker stepped out of the Marlowe room, her black shoes damp with rain, leaving fading traces on the marble floor. No one saw her off. No one dared meet her eyes. The air behind that closed door was thick as ashes, a place where two men who once believed themselves untouchable had been stripped of their crowns, and she, an anonymous waitress, had become the one to shatter the silence of the night. Outside, the wind cut sharp and cold. Chicago had just stopped raining, and the streets shimmered under neon reflections like 1,000 fragments of broken glass. Daniel Brooks stood waiting beneath the awning, his black umbrella tilted toward her. "The car's ready," he said softly. "Mrs. Hayes wants to see you right now." She nodded. Each step she took beside him trembled between disbelief and awe, as if the world had turned upside down and she had been thrown into a story that didn't belong to her. A sleek black Rolls-Royce idled at the curb. When Daniel opened the door, a wave of warmth and the faint scent of jasmine tea and leather drifted out, wrapping around her like a gentle wind moving against the storm. Inside, Eleanor Hayes sat reclined, her face calm as still water, though her eyes carried exhaustion. The light inside the car was soft, casting a silvery glow over her hair that glimmered like threads of light crossing the night. She looked at Chloe long and deep before a quiet smile touched her lips. "Sit," Daniel said. The door closed, sealing them away from the outside world. The sounds of rain, the rush of cars, the noise of life all faded until only breath and silence remained. Eleanor was the one to break it. Her voice was husky, fragile yet clear, as if every word was drawn from the bottom of her soul. "You know, Chloe," she said slowly, "for the past 6 months I've lived in a world where everyone spoke for me, but no one actually heard me." Chloe lowered her head. "I only did what I thought was right." "Right," Eleanor repeated softly, nodding. "And that is the rarest thing in this world, to do what is right, even when no one asks you to." Her gaze drifted to the passing lights outside the window as she continued her tone like someone recounting a distant dream. "After the accident, I woke up in the hospital, unable to speak a single word of English. My mind knew exactly what I wanted to say, but my mouth betrayed me. I looked at my colleagues, my doctors, my friends. They all tried to understand, but all they saw was a broken woman. I became poor Mrs. Hayes. Every day, I was reduced further, shrinking into a quieter version of myself. When they smiled awkwardly and said, 'You should rest,' I realized they no longer saw me as a leader." Chloe stayed silent, each word sinking into her heart like drops of heavy rain. "That's why," Eleanor continued, "I told no one the truth about this deal. I wanted to see who would still look at me as a person." She turned to Chloe, her eyes glimmering with new light. "And then I saw you. When Mark Ellison raised his voice, you frowned. When they laughed, you looked away. You didn't need to understand every clause, you understood pain. You saw me." The words struck something deep within Chloe, her throat tightening. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Her whole life had been about observing, growing up beside a mother who couldn't hear, learning to read emotion in silence, surviving in a noisy world by watching what others missed. "Maybe it's because I've spent my life next to someone who doesn't speak," she said softly. "And I learned that sometimes silence is the loudest cry." Eleanor smiled. "Yes, and tonight you made sure that cry was heard." She leaned slightly forward, pulling a cream-colored envelope from her bag and placing it on the table between them. "I have an offer for you, Chloe." Chloe's eyes widened. "An offer?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I want you to work for me. Not at the restaurant, at the Hayes Foundation, the art and technology trust I founded. I need someone who doesn't just see with their eyes, but with their heart. Someone who can listen to the world when it chooses to go silent." Chloe's mouth opened, but no words came out. Eleanor continued gently. "I know you're still studying fine arts. I'll cover all your tuition, even graduate school if you wish. You'll live in my estate, work with the Foundation's creative team, and travel with me to find voices and talents that the world has overlooked. I'm not asking you to be my assistant, Chloe. I'm asking you to be my companion." In that moment, the air between them seemed to melt. Chloe looked into the woman's eyes, tired, warm, yet glowing with something sacred. She remembered those same eyes in the restaurant, fierce, lonely, surrounded by people who never truly understood her. And now that same woman was opening a door, offering something far greater than a job, a sense of purpose. "Why me?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Eleanor answered with the gentlest smile of the night. "Because you saw me when no one else in that room did." The car glided through the night, leaving trails of reflected light scattered like falling stars across the wet streets. Inside Chloe, something broke open, not fear, but the shell she had worn for years. She was no longer the timid waitress standing in the shadows. She was stepping into a new world, one where the voice of courage mattered more than any title or degree. And in that moment, she knew her life had just changed forever. The car glided quietly down Michigan Avenue, the city lights reflecting across the windows like drifting stars. Chloe sat still, her hands clasped together, unable to fully believe that what was happening was real. She looked at Eleanor Hayes, The woman who had just been underestimated by the world, now gazing back at her with eyes filled with trust. Eleanor spoke slowly, her voice a warm current in the hush of the car. "You know, Chloe," she said softly, "I used to think this world only rewarded those who were loud. But you reminded me that sometimes it's the quiet ones who change everything with one small action at the right moment in the right place." Chloe smiled faintly. "I wasn't brave. I just couldn't stand seeing someone being treated that way." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glinting with understanding. "That is bravery. People think courage means standing in front of a crowd and shouting loudly. But sometimes it's simply a young woman who dares to say no in a room full of power." Silence filled the car again, gentle and complete. Then Eleanor continued, her tone dropping low like a vow. "I've spent my life building technology to help people connect better. But tonight, you made me realize that connection doesn't come from machines. It comes from kindness." The words made Chloe's eyes glisten. In that moment, every burdened tuition late-night shifts. The fear of losing everything seemed to dissolve into the rain. The car stopped in front of a glass building by the river, the headquarters of the Hayes Foundation. Daniel turned around and smiled. "Welcome to your new beginning." Chloe took a deep breath. She didn't know what the future would bring, only that after tonight she would never have to live unseen again. As Eleanor stepped out, she turned back and said softly, "Tomorrow we start. I need you by my side." The door closed, and the sound of the rain faded into the distance. Chloe watched as Eleanor's figure disappeared beneath the golden glow of the lights, feeling a door open inside her chest. A new chapter was waiting, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid to step through it. The next morning, the first light of day streamed through the towering glass windows of the Hayes Foundation. Chloe Parker stood in the grand lobby surrounded by abstract paintings and intricate models of technology, a space where art and innovation intertwined, reflecting both the past and the future. She was still wearing her simple white shirt, yet everything inside her felt different, as if during the night someone had replaced the blood in her veins with pure light. Eleanor Hayes approached, dressed in an elegant gray suit, her posture calm, but her eyes shining with new life. "Are you ready?" she asked. Chloe nodded her smile, trembling yet resolute. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she admitted softly, "but I'm ready to learn." Eleanor placed a steady hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "I don't need someone perfect," she said. "I need someone with the right heart." In the sunlight pouring across the glass hall, the two women, one who had once lost her voice and one who had once been too afraid to use hers, stood side by side. And in that moment, Chloe understood destiny doesn't always arrive through opportunity, but through the instant we dare to step out of silence and become the voice for what is right. That afternoon, from the 30th floor window of the Hayes Foundation, Chloe looked down at the bustling streets below. The city was still loud, yet to her, everything seemed quieter now, no longer filled with the noise of fear, only the steady rhythm of belief. On her desk lay a new employee badge engraved with the words, "Chloe Parker, Creative Liaison." She picked it up and smiled. Who would have thought that the girl who once poured wine in a room full of powerful men would now stand beside a woman who had become a symbol of resilience? The door behind her opened softly. Eleanor Hayes entered, carrying with her the familiar scent of jasmine tea. "How's your first day?" she asked. Chloe turned her eyes bright. "It feels like I've been given a chance to start over, but this time not just to live, but to matter." Eleanor nodded, her smile warm and knowing. "That's the only way to make sure you never lose your voice again." They stood together gazing out at the city as the setting sun cast its golden glow across the glass towers. And in that moment, Chloe knew sometimes one single act of courage is enough to rewrite the fate of two lives. From the perspective of a specialist in human dignity and behavior, the story of Eleanor Hayes and Chloe Parker is not merely an encounter between two generations, but a testament that in a world where the noise of power often drowns out the voice of what is right, courage can still rise from the smallest of places. When someone dares to speak up for what is right, they do more than change their own destiny. They awaken the humanity that has long been asleep around them.